Well, hello, fun ahead friends. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Next to me is a beautiful 2001 996 Targa. Absolutely stunning car. This particular one is in pretty incredible shape. It only has 47,500 miles on the clock, and yet, here is the engine and transmission out of this car. Why? Because, well, we're doing kind of a major mechanical refresh because, well, this thing's 23 years old. It needs done. Aging rubbers and plastics are always the things that start to go bad on these engines. So we are doing a major mechanical refresh on this thing to replace a lot of those aging rubbers and plastics. And of course, we're getting into that intermediate shaft bearing as well to replace that. It is the original one. In today's episode, we're beginning to tear into this thing and start to do some A, parts analysis, and B, parts replacement, which will be so satisfying to do, and C, you're not gonna wanna miss it. Let's go ahead and get right into it.
Rippin', tearin', the rippin' and the tearin'.
Alrighty, time to start getting our engine and transmission separated from one another. What's interesting, however, is somehow the process of separating the engine and transmission has kind of already been started for us. This bolt right here was literally finger tight, just sitting there. It was like that when I took the engine and transmission out of the car. That is some evidence that the transmission and engine have clearly been separated before. The transmission wasn't reinstalled to the highest quality standard of all time. Well, all right, as you just saw, we have the transmission separated from the engine, and we have the clutch pressure plate and flywheel assembly separated off the engine, which obviously we needed to remove in order to gain access to the intermediate shaft flange. So, removing the transmission and engine from one another was kind of my first indication that maybe the person who did this job last was very much not super detail oriented. None of the bolts were torqued. There's no way they were. Some of them were tight, some of them were just past hand loose, and then obviously this one right here, was literally just sitting there completely loose. In addition, we came to what looks like the source of our oil leak here, but I don't think it's as obvious as what meets the eye here. Now initially you would look at this and think, okay, the rear main seal doesn't really look like it's leaking. In fact, it does look like it may have been replaced. So then that would lead you to believe that it's the intermediate shaft flange leaking. Now I'm not 100% ruling that out. However, it doesn't look like that's what's leaking to me. When one of these leaks, it's oil. This does not appear to be oil. This is a very thick residue of some kind. And of course, yes, you could say, well, you know, you could have oil residue and then dirt mixing together. Well, also this is a more or less sealed area. You don't have a ton of dirt getting in here. So I don't think that there would necessarily be that oil-dirt combination making this kind of weird stuff. What I think this is the oil, or the grease rather, that's inside of a dual mass flywheel. Now the flywheel that I just took out of this thing is in great shape. It doesn't have much play at all. But the clutch is in terrible shape. It has a ton of wear on it, which I believe it would indicate that it's original. And so is the pressure plate. I think those seals aged, gave up the ghost, and when that happens, they shoot the grease, the dampening grease that's inside of these things everywhere. I think they realized they needed a new flywheel. They threw a new flywheel in here, put the original clutch plate back in, put the original pressure plate back in, didn't even clean it up, slapped it together, didn't torque the bolts, and called it a day. That's not ideal, but I think that is the residue that we're seeing, and then just over time that has kind of seeped out of the little holes between the engine and transmission. So I'm gonna go ahead and get this thing up on our engine stand. That'll take me a few minutes, and then we'll pick up in a sec. Well, after much shuffling around, as you can see, we have our engine up on our engine stand. So we can have really nice access, 360 degrees, to the entire engine. We gotta start tearing this thing down. We've got a little bit of time and a lot of stuff to take apart, so I'm just gonna go ahead and get right into it. How far down are we taking this thing? Well, like I said, we are not going to be removing the valve covers on this particular job. This engine, this iteration of engine, wasn't known to eat timing chains in the same way that car's engine did because of the fact that it's the 3-chain engine. But everything on top of the engine is coming off. We need to get down as far as these gaskets right here at the very bottom of the intake runners, which means that literally everything up here has to come off, plus the fact that we're going to be replacing several things in the valley of the engine as well. That's enough babbling. Like I said, we've got a lot to do. I'm going to start doing it.
Many minutes later.
Woo! Wow. Much time, heat, patience, and PB blaster later, we have the majority of the exhaust system removed. Now, I wasn't originally going to really touch the exhaust because, as I've mentioned many times, exhausts are just, they become a rabbit hole because every single bolt is inherently rusted and just heat seized to whatever it's screwed into because of so many heat cycles over time. However, because these are such compact engine compartments, the exhausts inherently are very compact as well. They're very packed in up and around the engine, and it becomes a problem with access. So anyway, good news, bad news scenario. I was able to get the majority of the exhaust off. 4 of the 6 of the bolts in the bank 2 exhaust manifold are just not gonna wanna move. So I decided we're leaving well enough alone. I'm not even gonna bother with trying to get those out because they're just gonna break. That was a very long-winded explanation of saying sometimes before you actually dive into the thing, you've got to do some things to get access to the thing to make your life that much easier when you're doing the thing. Does that make sense? Look, as you can see, we've got everything off of the top of the engine of Booker's super sick, tight Targa, which is exactly how far we wanted to take this engine down. Like I mentioned, we're not going to take the valve covers off. We have not, however, removed the intermediate shaft bearing, which we'll get to in just a short bit here. So I figured this is a good point, a good little, waypoint, if you will, to go ahead and analyze some of the parts we've taken off this engine so far. So far, most everything looks pretty good. I would say overall this engine is in pretty good shape. However, I think a lot of this stuff is original. And it's kind of Porsche's own fault because of course they pack everything up into this car, up into these cars rather, and it becomes very hard to access them unless you do an engine out job. I've talked about this at length in previous videos. Easy to work on as long as you take the engine out. Yeah, so I don't think this engine's ever been out, and therefore a lot of this stuff just has not been replaced. So let's go ahead and start looking at a couple of the items that have a little bit of carnage. So a couple of the items that I wanted to look at are back on this table. One of those items, actually there are many of this one item, those items are the coil packs. And if you've watched the channel for a while, you'll know that this is a fairly common thing on these coil packs as they age. In fact, I had one of the coil packs go out on my base model Boxster due to this plastic cracking and they're getting some water inside of it. They're all cracked up like this. Every single one of them has some amounts of cracking. Now, like I said, these engines are packed in there, and these coil packs are actually under kind of a heat shield that's on each bank, and it's kind of a pain to take that off because the muffler actually covers it up. So from underneath the car, it's not really easy to get in there and swap the coil packs and spark plugs out. You can do it. I have done it. It's an absolute pain in the butt to do. And not saying that these are an engine out item, by no means are they, but they're a total pain in the butt and they're just a lot easier to do with the engine out. So I think whoever had been maintaining this car before Booker owned it, just chose to never replace these because these very much are original, or they look original. These are the original coil pack design. They've upgraded them since. Therefore, I think these are from 2002. All right, next thing I wanted to look at is this water pump. And overall, this thing is in solid shape. I don't know if this is original. Again, these are kind of a pain to access with the engine and everything in the car because of that engine mount bracket that literally sits up like right against this, and you have to like move that bracket back in order to get enough clearance just to get these fins up and around the engine block to get the water pump out. So doing a water pump with everything in the car is definitely a pain in the butt, and these don't like to last more than, say, 50,000-ish miles. People have gotten, of course, more mileage out of them, but it's not uncommon to see one fail around that mileage or even sooner. This particular one doesn't have any play in the bearing, but the bearing does not sound great. Listen, I'll put it up to my mic. Hopefully you can hear that, but there's definitely some crunchiness going on in that bearing. Of course, this thing would have had a decent amount of life left in it, but those are supposed to be silent, so good thing we were replacing the water pump. So the next thing I want to go ahead and show you guys has to do with the PCV system. When you look at this little breather joint here that's on the end of bank 2, you can see kind of a milky substance, and that is an oil mix. You can see it both there, and when you look inside of the breather hose that goes from bank to bank between the air oil separator and bank 2 cylinder head, the air oil separator has definitely failed on this engine, but good thing we're replacing it. Hey. Well, the last thing I just want to go ahead and analyze during this little analysis segment are the spark plugs. Now, right away, you're probably looking at the spark plug from cylinder 2 going, dude, that one looks really, really bad. What's up with that? Well, the valve cover little seal had been leaking a little bit of oil down into the spark plug tube. 5 out of the 6 of these spark plugs look very good, very consistent. There is one, however, that doesn't look so good, and it's got me a little bit worried as far as the overall health of this engine. Now, if you know anything about bore scoring, you know that it occurs on bank 2, so you're probably sitting there going, please say that the bad spark plug is not on bank 2. It is. It's cylinder 4. And I don't love to see it. So here's cylinder 4, here's cylinder 5. Cylinder 4 is clearly darker in color and has quite a bit more carbon buildup on the outside of it, the spark end of it. Cylinder 5 looks very, very healthy. No problems here whatsoever. So you're saying to yourself, all right, so does that mean it's bore scoring? Well, it could be happening from bore scoring in the mode of failure of there's a scored bore in cylinder 4.
I get divorced in Harrison Ford and I'm in a Porsche and I'm flowing ports.
And oil is getting by the piston rings because it's scored up. Therefore, you're combusting oil and getting this carbon buildup on this spark plug. Now, obviously, I just told you that there was oil coming out of that air oil separator, and therefore, it was definitely getting put back into the intake. Why do I know that? Well, because I looked at the intake. This is the entrance point for the PCV gases to re-enter into the intake. Now, when you look at the intake path, you've got high velocity gases coming up into this and then mixing back into the intake stream and then hypothetically dispersing, at this T-joint here to go between cylinder 1 and cylinder 4. When I look inside of this, so mind you, every one of these engines, if you take them apart right now, if they have any amount of miles on them, all of these engines have some amount of oil inside of the intake. That's just how they are. That doesn't mean they're burning oil. There's just always a little bit that escapes through the air oil separator and ends up coating the inside of these plenums. However, when you look on the inside of this plenum, the side that faces cylinder 1 is more or less dry. The side that faces cylinder 4 is really wet, which tells me that once this high velocity air enters this stream, most of it is going this way. Therefore, I think that's exactly why the cylinder 4 spark plug looks the way it does. It is in fact burning excessive oil because of our failed air oil separator. I think as of now, we can say that cylinder 4 is not scored up. We're gonna find out for sure when we get the oil analysis report back from Blackstone in a couple of weeks. Just as a quick update, as I am sitting here editing this video, we did end up getting the Blackstone oil analysis report back. Good news, everything looks basically where it needs to be. So the two areas that we're gonna pay most attention to are aluminum and silicon. Both are well within range. Silicon especially because if you see elevated amounts of silicon, then that means that it is cylinder wall material that is making its way into the oil. Why that? Because, well, the cylinder walls are locasil, which means localized silicon. So if you start eating up your cylinder walls, then you start removing that localized silicon that is the coating on the cylinder wall. So good news, I don't believe that this engine is experiencing any levels of bore scoring at this time. Let's proceed. Well, all right, friends, it's officially time to start working on that intermediate shaft bearing. First and foremost, we're gonna go ahead and remove our cam plugs here. Then we're gonna go ahead and turn our crank and cams into bank one top dead center. Lock our crank in place and our cams. Gonna go ahead and remove all 3 of our timing chain tensioners. Then I just like to go ahead and remove any amount of dirt and grime around the intermediate shaft flange so we don't risk getting any amount of unwanted contamination inside our engine. Next up, loosening up that intermediate shaft flange. Popping this puppy back a little bit, and there it is, our old intermediate shaft bearing. Putting our bearing puller on her, and she is out. Out with the old. Ah, yes. Did you see that? As you just saw, we got the old intermediate shaft bearing out of this super sexy M96 engine from Booker's tight target.
Tight.
As you can see, it is the single row variety. For comparison, here is a dual row intermediate shaft bearing that was in the earlier cars. Boom. As you can see, it's literally half the width because it's a single row.
You can tell because of the way it is.
How does this bearing look? So keep in mind this bearing does have 47,500 miles on the clock, and it is 23 years old. And of course, there's the long-standing theory behind the failure mode of these bearings that basically the less a car is driven, the more prone it is to IMS bearing failure. And that's not 100% true. It has everything to do with how you're driving the car. Basically, is it only driven every Sunday to church by that little old lady and like 2 miles there and 2 miles back and not fully allowed to warm up? Well, yes. Then in that case, you will end up having more IMS bearing problems, most likely. But if you're actually getting it out and taking it for extended drives and allowing the engine to get fully up to temp, i.e. the oil getting fully up to temp, then these are less so an issue. So the question is, which one is it for this car? Well, it does seem that this one, in fact, was not driven by a little old lady only on Sundays to church and back, because this bearing is in perfect shape. Literally perfect. This is freaking textbook. This thing is not making a single sound. Like, you cannot even discern a noise coming from this thing. The motion of it feels perfect. There is zero play in it. This thing is literally a textbook intermediate shaft bearing and could have remained in this engine for a very, very, very long time to come with absolutely no issues whatsoever. Now, I know that's a little bit anticlimactic, but hey, that's the fact of the matter. This thing is in tip-top shape. And I know there were some of you out there who were like, that thing's only got 47,000 miles on the clock, that IMS bearing is gonna be shot. Dude, shun the non-believers.
Shun the non-believer. Shun.
This, you know, the IMS bearing, as goofy of a design choice as it was on Porsche's part to do this, it is an overblown issue. I think it has everything to do with how these cars were driven in their lifetime, and clearly this one was allowed to warm up properly for the majority of the drive cycles throughout its lifetime. So, good news is, this thing is in great shape. Even better news is we're gonna put a brand spanking new Allen Engineering bearing right back in this one's place so that this thing can be super bulletproof reliable for a very, very long time to come. Let's go ahead and get that done. Well, friends, and there you have it. I just got the install of our brand new Allen Engineering IMS bearing into Booker's super sick M96 engine. I also went ahead and finished everything up with regards to that job, meaning we put 3 brand new timing chain tensioners in place, unlocked the cams, put brand new cam plugs in place. This engine is officially ready to go with regards to the IMS bearing. Of course, we still have so much more yet to do, but that will actually have to wait until next week's episode. We're gonna go ahead and call it here today, but I feel very good about it because we've actually made a ton of progress. We started this episode with the engine and transmission completely together, and now they're separated. We have all of the parts off the top of this engine. We've analyzed a bunch of stuff. We even swapped out an intermediate shaft bearing. But we definitely have a lot of things yet to do, not even just things with regards to the engine. We're gonna be swapping out some things on the car as well that you can't do with the engine in place. And then we'll begin putting things back on top of this engine to get it ready for reinstallation. So With that, if you really enjoyed this episode, please do me a huge favor and hit that like button, and please subscribe as it helps out my channel so much. And then you get to see super sick automotive content coming down the pipeline via Funahead TV to you every single week. Thank you again so much for being here today. I appreciate each and every one of you for being here. Yes, you, I'm looking right at you. And I will see you all in next week's episode. See ya.
Rippin', tearin'. The rippin' and the tearin'.
Sean.
Yeah.